Carlin's mouth, which is apparently okay with the left. Now, if that didn't make you angry, Merry Christmas, this will. Tom Coburn's 2013 Waste Book was released this week, his annual compilation of how elected officials who've taken an oath to uphold the sacred honor of stewardship entrusted to them by you, the voter, how they've taken us to the cleaners. Americans work on average of 3 months out of every year just to pay the government. Middle-class families Groupon so that members of Congress can spend $5 million, as reported in the Waste Book, on customized crystal stemware. Fancy. Now, meanwhile, Congress just passed a budget which, as I discussed on this program last week, makes a really weak promise of trimming $7 billion from the deficit over a decade. Not by closing tax credit loopholes for illegal immigrants, as The Blaze has reported, or by ending the Obama phone program, or by eliminating public funding for Obamacare public relations. No, our veterans, of all people, take the cut. Disabled veterans aren't exempt either. In this new budget deal, military personnel who have suffered injuries severe enough to warrant full retirement pay and benefits will see those benefits reduced. Now, the Air Force Times notes that the Ryan Murray budget bill actually reduces the cost of living adjustments for military retirees under the age of 62 to 1 percentage point less than the annual inflation in consumer prices. The Department of Defense actually confirmed this with Senator Kelly Ayette's office just this week. Now, 1 percentage point may not sound like a lot until you consider that it amounts to thousands of dollars in lost income. Military members stand to lose well over $120,000 over a lifetime. And for many, that's a home. That's savings. Now, I'm not one of those individuals. I'm not one of those people who thinks that, defense spending is some kind of sacred cow. But these men and women of our American volunteer military signed their lives and honor on the dotted line with certain assurances. And among those assurances are benefits for themselves and their families. Now, included in this, as I said before, are our disabled veterans, men and women who bore the brunt of the battle on the front lines, who never leave a man behind the way Uncle Sam is now leaving them behind. And out of all the things that Congress could target for cuts, out of everything, I gave you some examples. Benefits for our veterans should have been the very last thing on a very long list. And some of these men and women, after serving our country for 20-some-odd years, they're told now that they'll lose money they planned on having for retirement. You don't pull the rug out from under the men and women who keep watch at night so we can all sleep soundly in our warm beds. Now, to discuss this latest affront to our men and women in uniform, my very good friend Stephen Yates with the D.C. International Advisory Group and former top advisor to Dick Cheney joins me now. Stephen, it's always a pleasure. It's good to have you on here.
Hi, Dana. Great to be with you.
So you and I, we've talked anytime there's any kind of a budget agreement. It seems that the things that a certain party in Washington, D.C., they never want to target, the things that really drive up debt, the things that really drive up deficit and big spending, which, of course, are always entitlements. And Obama phones still on the table, the tax credit loopholes that I mentioned. Put into layman's terms for us, because you specifically have worked on military issues and foreign policy issues, put into layman's terms, how hard is this going to affect military families?
Well, I think you had it exactly right in terms of the priorities in the overall budget process. This should have been the last of the areas to deal with. Now, I have a slightly different point of view when it comes to the particulars of it, just because when I've looked at government broadly, whether it's the intelligence agencies, the military, the Pentagon, and other agencies, all big government groups have the risk of mission creep and entitlement creep. And when we're looking at retirement benefits for veterans, always politically sensitive. As best I can read it, no one is cutting the retirement, but there is this adjustment to the cost of living adjustment, which is basically plussing up retirement based on inflation.
Right.
And many of my friends who have served in the military, they'll retire in their late 30s or early 40s, and they'll work full time for another couple of decades. And the question I think a lot of people can reasonably ask is not whether we're cutting the retirement they were promised, But whether these cost of living adjustments allow some room, given that they're receiving benefits that are well above what the private sector counterparts get, thanks to the service they gave the country.
Right. And those who have, as I was mentioning earlier, those who have been injured severely enough where they're receiving these benefits now, I mean, is there, in terms of your perspective there, I mean, how is this, because they may not be able to go out and get a full-time job. I have a friend who, he is a Marine, and he was in Afghanistan, and he was hurt pretty badly, and he suffers from PTSD, and he has physical injuries, which, he can't lift heavy things. He was in the VA for quite a while. How does this affect these folks who can't go out and get full-time jobs? And I know that was the presupposition that Paul Ryan had, which is one of the things that he used in kind of justifying why this 1% cut was acceptable.
That's right. Well, in the end, my hope is that it will not be affected, because these changes were not supposed to go into effect until the fiscal year for 2016. And I think the framers of this agreement have realized that there needs to be a fix. And so they've committed in January to come back and try to address this issue of the wounded warriors and basically those who have left the military due to some kind of disability and aren't able to get full-time employment. And so I think the spirit of what they're going after are those who retire from the military but are engaged in full-time employment until basically the normal retirement age of 62 or older, that they will have a slight cut in their cost of living adjustment. But they must come back in January and fix this loophole,
right,
because it's absolutely not acceptable for the wounded and those unable to find employment to take this cut.
Right, and it was predicated on the proposal that $7 billion, something along the lines of $7 billion would be cut from the deficit up until like 2022. But, you know this for a long time, Stephen, being in D.C. and working with different administrations. What's promised now, especially when you don't see the benefits of this 10 years out, that's a promise that's not necessarily ever going to be kept. I mean, there's never been a promise like that that's been kept in Washington.
That's right, and that is basically, well, trust is a big word when we're talking about government generally and with this administration, frankly, on a whole range of issues. And so I can understand completely why there would be a great deal of concern about why this segment of our population bearing this brunt when so many others seem to have gone through unscathed, and why would we have them commit to making an additional sacrifice when we know that Washington itself doesn't sacrifice very much at all on their promises of cuts.
And I know Senate Republicans were really fighting hard to amend this and to block this from going into effect. I know Jeff Sessions was really leading the battle on this. And of course, Democrats, they have the power in the Senate to block them. But it seems that it's been kind of a tug of war as to who's actually getting blamed for this. A lot of people look at Congressman Paul Ryan in the House and say, well, he should have never included this in here in the first place. So ultimately, who do you think comes out looking better? Because somebody has to take the blame. That's how it always is, especially with the press.
Well, I think for now, the people who are going to take the blame are the two faces that announced the deal. Now, I think that in the long term, if they do come back in January and close some of these loopholes, the rest of the budget is actually where their reputations are going to stand. And so that's something that longer period is going to be required to judge. But when we look at the government as a whole, where spending has grown out of control, I think everything has to be on the table. I agree completely with the idea, though, that veterans shouldn't be the first to make the sacrifice in the broader cause.
Right, and you and I have talked about this before at length on my radio program. I mean, we don't believe that defense spending is some kind of sacred cow. I mean, there's always, if you look, any department in which you look, you're always going to be able to find something being wasted, something that can be cut. But when you consider just 3 weeks ago, before when I was still living in St. Louis, before I moved to Dallas, I saw one of those tents on the side of the road giving out free government phones. That's what the sign said. And I thought, where on earth are they still getting the money to do this? I mean, we heard all about the gloom and doom of sequestration cuts, but yet they're funding this program where they're handing out free Obama phones. And you would think that Democrats would pay attention to the optics of this, especially since so many try to play to the favor of veterans and other military members every election.
That's right. And I think that we have so much in the budget that needs to be dialed back to reality. I mean, the Republic actually was standing and was well defended before we added trillion-dollar deficits every year for several years. And so we really need to get back to some sense of reality about how much should be spent. And how about the crazy notion of getting a handle on where your revenues are going to be and budget accordingly? And so that's one of the greatest frustrations with the oversell of this deal is it's very, very little savings. And then the savings that were put forward are on the backs of a part of our society that should be revered more than cut.
Absolutely. Stephen Yates with the DC International Advisory, DCAdvisory.org. Stephen, it's always a pleasure. Good to talk with you here on The Blaze. I appreciate you coming on. Thanks. All right, folks.
Thank you, Dana.
Thanks, Stephen.